The woman in the faded photograph smiled sweetly, her dark eyes gentle beneath carefully pinned curls. Ruth Holloway looked like someone's grandmother, the kind who'd bake cookies and hum hymns while hanging laundry on a Sunday afternoon. But in the basement of the Chester County Courthouse, there was a filing cabinet that told a different story. 8 marriage certificates, 8 death certificates, 8 husbands who'd walked into Ruth Holloway's life healthy and walked out in coffins. Detective Sarah Mitchell had seen evil wear many faces during her 23 years with the Pennsylvania State Police, but she'd never seen it wear one quite like this. As she spread the documents across her desk on that humid August morning in 1995, her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from rage. Because if what she suspected was true, Ruth Holloway hadn't just killed 8 men. She'd gotten away with it for nearly 40 years. The question wasn't whether Ruth Holloway was guilty. The question was how a black woman in mid-century America, living under the constant scrutiny that came with her skin color, had managed to commit murder after murder without anyone noticing, or had people noticed and simply not cared. As Sarah would soon discover, the answer was far more disturbing than she could have imagined, and the investigation would force her to confront the darkest corners of both human nature and American justice. This is the story of how death came knocking 8 times at Ruth Holloway's door, and how one detective's obsession with the truth would finally bring decades of secrets into the light. The Widows' Club. Last one of them buried in Greenwood Cemetery, neat as you please. And Ruth still walking around free as a bird. Sarah looked at her mother, who was suddenly very focused on her stitching. "Mama, did you know about this?" Evelyn Mitchell sighed. "It's old news, baby, ancient history. Happened over the course of, 40 years? Started back in the 50s. Started in 1954, Clara Washington said precisely. Ruth married her first husband, James Holloway, in the spring. He was dead by Christmas. Pneumonia, they said. Sarah's mind was already working, cataloging, questioning. And the others? What followed was a litany of death that made Sarah's blood run cold. The second husband, Marcus Webb, had died in 1957 from what the doctor called a stroke. The third, Leonard Price, succumbed to food poisoning in 1961. The fourth, William Jackson, had a heart attack in 1965. The pattern continued through the decades, each death separated by just enough time to seem coincidental, each one attributed to natural causes or unfortunate accidents. The last one was in 1991, Clara said quietly. Thomas Green. He lasted 2 years with Ruth, longer than most. Died of kidney failure, the doctor said. Sarah's detective brain was screaming. 8 dead husbands over 37 years should have triggered investigations, autopsies, someone asking questions. How did no one look into this? 8 deaths connected to one woman, that's beyond suspicious. The women exchanged those loaded glances again. Finally, it was Dorothy Freeman who spoke the truth Sarah was beginning to suspect. Detective Mitchell. Sarah, you're young enough that maybe you don't remember how things were. Shh. How things still are, if we're being honest. Black folks dying in Chester County, especially black men. That wasn't something that got a lot of official attention. And Ruth, well, Ruth knew how to play the grieving widow, knew how to cry at the right times, say the right things. She was real good at seeming helpless. Plus, added Evelyn Mitchell quietly, most of those men weren't exactly upstanding citizens. A couple of them drank heavy. 1 or 2 had been in trouble with the law. When they died, folks just figured it was the life catching up with them, you know. Nobody wanted to look too close. Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same anger that had driven her to become a cop in the first place. Justice wasn't supposed to depend on who you were or what you looked like, but she'd spent 2 decades learning that it absolutely did. Did anyone ever suspect her, file a report? Oh, people suspected, Clara Washington said darkly. People talked. But talking and proving are 2 different things, especially when you're talking about a black woman and dead black men in a town that barely noticed we existed, except when they needed someone to clean their houses or work their fields. The doctors signed the death certificates, the undertaker buried the bodies, and life went on. Besides, Dorothy added, Ruth was careful. Years between each death. Different causes. Different doctors, mostly. She was always the perfect wife right up until the funeral, crying and carrying on, playing the devastated widow. Then a few years would pass and she'd marry again. It was like watching a spider rebuild her web. Sarah's mind was racing. The statute of limitations didn't apply to murder. If Ruth Holloway had killed even one of those men, let alone 8, she could still be prosecuted. But it had been decades. Evidence would be long gone. Bodies buried, possibly cremated. Medical records from the 50s and 60s might not even exist anymore. Still, something in Sarah couldn't let this go. Maybe it was the detective in her. Maybe it was something deeper, a rage against all the injustices that got buried because the victims weren't considered important enough to investigate. These men, whatever their flaws, had deserved better. They'd deserved someone to care when they died under suspicious circumstances. This woman, Ruth Holloway, Sarah said carefully. She's still alive? Still in Chester County? Lives over on Maple Street, Clara confirmed. That big Victorian house with the green shutters. You know it. Sarah knew it. She drove past it almost every day on her way to work. She'd always thought it was a beautiful house, well-maintained. Flowers blooming in the garden. She'd never imagined it might be a serial killer's lair. I want to talk to her, Sarah said. Baby, no, her mother said immediately. This is old business. Let it lie. Mama, if this woman killed 8 people. If, Evelyn stressed. If. And even if she did, what are you going to do about it after all these years? You'll just be stirring up pain for nothing. But Sarah was already standing, carefully folding the quilt section she'd been working on. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to investigate. And if Ruth Holloway's a murderer, then she's going to answer for it, no matter how long ago it happened. The silence that followed was heavy wit. Unspoken warnings. Finally, Clara Washington spoke, her voice grave. You be careful, Detective Mitchell. Ruth Holloway has survived 8 husbands and 40 years of whispers. That's not luck. That's something else entirely. You go poking at her, you best be ready for what you might find. Sarah left the quilting circle with her mind churning. She drove home through the quiet streets of Chester County, past the house with the green shutters where Ruth Holloway presumably slept peacefully, untroubled by ghosts. 8 men dead, 40 years of getting away with murder if murder it was. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind constructing and deconstructing theories. By 3 in the morning, she'd given up on rest. She got up, made coffee, and started researching. The Chester County record system was partially digitized, but anything before 1985 required actually going to the courthouse and digging through physical files. Sarah made a list of what she'd need: marriage certificates, death certificates, property records, medical examiner reports if they existed. She'd need to find out where each husband had died, which hospitals had treated them, which doctors had signed off on the causes of death. It was a massive undertaking, made more difficult by the passage of time, but Sarah had never backed down from a challenge in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became obsessed. She spent every spare moment at the courthouse, in the records room, pulling dusty files and copying documents. She tracked down death certificates, autopsy reports where they existed. They didn't for most of the earlier deaths. Hospital admission records. She created a timeline, a visual representation of Ruth Holloway's marriages and the deaths that ended them. What she found was chilling in its precision. Ruth Holloway, born Ruth Ann Morris in 1912, had married her first husband, James Holloway, in April 1954, when she was 42 years old. James had been 51, a widower with 3 grown children who'd initially opposed the marriage. He'd been in good health according to his medical records, worked as a custodian at the local high school. Then, 8 months after the wedding, he'd died suddenly of what the death certificate listed as pneumonia complications. Ruth had inherited his house and a small life insurance policy. The pattern repeated with eerie consistency. Ruth would be alone for 2 to 4 years, always maintaining James Holloway's name, her widow name, she called it, according to the records. Then she'd marry again. The husband would be older, usually a widower or long-time bachelor, often someone with a little money, a house, some assets, and within a few years the husband would be dead. Marcus Webb, husband number 2, died of a stroke at 57. Leonard Price, number 3, died of food poisoning at 62. William Jackson, number 4, died of a heart attack at 65. The pattern continued. Samuel Freeman, kidney disease at 59. Robert Collins, liver failure at 68. Edward Washington, stroke at 71. Thomas Green, kidney failure at 66. What made Sarah's investigation harder was that most of these men had legitimate health issues. Several had been heavy drinkers, one had diabetes, another had high blood pressure. On the surface, their deaths could easily be explained by natural causes or lifestyle factors, but the pattern was too perfect. 8 marriages, 8 deaths, and Ruth Holloway walking away each time with the house, the bank account, the life insurance payout. By Sarah's calculations, Ruth had inherited the equivalent of nearly $500,000 over the course of 40 years, a fortune for a black woman of her generation. The breakthrough came when Sarah found the medical records for Thomas Green, the last husband. Unlike the earlier deaths, Thomas had died in a hospital in 1991, recent enough that detailed records still existed. Sarah spent hours reading through his chart, looking for anything unusual. And there it was, buried in the nursing notes. Thomas Green had been admitted to the hospital with symptoms of kidney failure. But his initial blood work had shown something else, unusually high levels of potassium and phosphorus, patterns consistent with chronic poisoning. The attending physician had noted it as curious, but had ultimately attributed it to kidney disease. Thomas had died 3 days later, and no one had questioned it further. Sarah's hands shook as she photocopied the records. Potassium poisoning. It was a classic method, hard to detect, especially in someone with existing health problems. High levels of potassium could cause heart arrhythmias, kidney failure, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for natural causes, especially in an older person. She needed to talk to that attending physician. She needed to know if anyone had ever considered the possibility of poisoning. But first she needed to talk to Ruth Holloway herself. Sarah drove to Maple Street on a Wednesday afternoon, her heart pounding. The Victorian house with green shutters looked peaceful in the autumn sunshine, its garden still blooming with late-season flowers. Someone had hung a wreath on the front door, cheerful and welcoming. Sarah sat in her car for a long moment, gathering her courage. She'd interviewed hundreds of suspects in her career, but this felt different. If Ruth Holloway was what Sarah suspected, then she was sitting down with a woman who'd perfected the art of murder, who'd been getting away with it for 4 decades. Finally, Sarah got out of the car and walked up the path to the front door. She rang the bell and waited. The woman who answered was small and elderly, her hair completely white, her dark skin softened with age. She wore a floral dress and a cardigan despite the mild weather, and she smiled at Sarah with genuine warmth. "Can I help you, dear?" Ruth Holloway asked, her voice sweet as honey. "Mrs. Holloway, my name is Detective Sarah Mitchell with the Pennsylvania State Police. I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions." Something flickered in Ruth's eyes, there and gone so quickly Sarah almost missed it. Then the sweet smile was back. "Of course, Detective. Please come in. I just made some tea." Sarah followed Ruth into the house, every instinct screaming at her to be careful. The interior was as well maintained as the exterior, filled with antique furniture and family photographs. Sarah noticed several wedding photos on the mantel. Different men standing beside Ruth in her younger days, all of them smiling, none of them knowing they had only a few years left to live. "What can I help you with?" Ruth asked as she poured tea into delicate china cups. Her hands were steady, her demeanor calm. If she was nervous about a detective showing up at her door, she didn't show it. "I've been reviewing some old records," Sarah began carefully, "and I noticed that you've been married several times." 8 times, in fact. "I have," Ruth agreed easily. "I've been very unlucky in love, Detective. God saw fit to take every one of my husbands from me. It's been a hard life, but I've endured. And each of your husbands died of natural causes?" Sarah pressed. "That's what the doctors said," Ruth replied, her tone still sweet but something harder underneath now. "I'm sure you've seen the death certificates." "I have. I've also been looking at medical records, particularly for your last husband, Thomas Green. Did you know that his blood work showed signs of poisoning?" Ruth's cup clinked against the saucer as she set it down, the first sign of emotion Sarah had seen. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas had kidney disease. The doctors said so. High levels of potassium can cause kidney failure," Sarah said, watching Ruth's face carefully. "It can also be administered deliberately." Through food or drink, for instance. "Detective Mitchell," Ruth said, and now her voice was cold, the sweetness stripped away like a mask removed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm investigating suspicious deaths, Mrs. Holloway. 8 husbands over 40 years, all of whom left you their assets. You have to admit, it's an unusual pattern." Ruth stood up, her small frame radiating fury. "You know what else is unusual, Detective? A black woman in the 1950s Findy NG any way to survive at all. You think life was easy for me? You think I had choices? I did what I had to do to keep a roof over my head, to have something to call my own. And if some men happen to die along the way, well, men die. That's what they do. You can't prove anything different." The admission hung in the air between them. Not quite a confession, but close enough to make Sarah's pulse race. "I can exhume the bodies," Sarah said quietly. "Modern forensic techniques can find things 1950s doctors couldn't. If you poisoned those men, Mrs. Holloway, I will prove it." Ruth laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "Go ahead and try, Detective. Dig up 8 graves. Spend months, years running tests on decades-old remains. And at the end of it, what will you have? Maybe some elevated mineral levels that could mean anything. Maybe nothing at all, because time destroys evidence. And even if you find something, you'll have to convince a jury that an 83-year-old woman is a serial killer. A black woman who everyone will say was just trying to survive in a world stacked against her." Sarah stood up too, facing Ruth across the coffee table. "Justice doesn't have an expiration date." "Justice," Ruth spat the word like a curse. "Don't talk to me about justice. Where was justice when I couldn't get a decent job because of my skin color? Where was justice when my first husband beat me and the police laughed when I called for help? Where was justice when I watched my mother clean white women's toilets until her hands bled? I made my own justice, Detective. And I'm not sorry for it." Sarah left Ruth Holloway's house that afternoon with more questions than answers. Had Ruth essentially confessed? Or had she simply been an angry old woman tired of implications? Either way, Sarah knew she had her work cut out for her. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months of Sarah's life. She got court orders to exhume 4 of the 8 bodies, choosing the ones most likely to yield usable evidence. She consulted with forensic toxicologists, historians, experts in historical poisoning cases. She tracked down the few surviving relatives of Ruth's victims and listened to their stories of the charming woman who'd seemed too good to be true. What emerged was a portrait of a killer unlike any Sarah had encountered before. Ruth Holloway hadn't killed out of passion or rage. She'd killed methodically, patiently, with the cold calculation of someone who'd turned murder into a survival strategy. She'd chosen her victims carefully, men with assets but no close family to ask questions. She'd varied her methods, never using the same poison twice in a way that would create a recognizable pattern. She'd played the grieving widow so convincingly that even doctors had been fooled. And she'd done it all while navigating the treacherous waters of being a black woman in mid-century America, using society's blind spots and prejudices to her advantage. Who would believe that a sweet-faced black widow could be a serial killer? Who would bother to investigate when the victims were just black men that society barely valued? Ruth had counted on that invisibility, that dismissiveness, and it had worked for 40 years. The weight of evidence. The exhumations began in January 1996, during one of the coldest winters Pennsylvania had seen in decades. Ra stood in Greenwood Cemetery as workers carefully excavated the grave of Thomas Green, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The cemetery director, a nervous white man named Harold Peterson, hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. "This is highly irregular," he kept saying. "Highly irregular. In 40 years, I've never had to exhume so many bodies at once." "Then it's a day of firsts for both of us," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the work crew. She'd never exhumed anyone before either, let alone 4 people as part of a murder investigation spanning 4 decades. The forensic team had set up a mobile laboratory in a trailer at the edge of the cemetery. Dr. Patricia Alvarez, the state's leading forensic toxicologist, was leading the effort. She'd told Sarah that finding usable evidence would be challenging at best, impossible at worst. Bodies decompose, tissues break down, poisons metabolize and disappear. But certain heavy metals and compounds could linger in bone and hair, especially if the poisoning had been chronic rather than acute. If she was poisoning them slowly, over months or years, Dr. Alvarez had explained, there's a chance we'll find elevated levels in the bone tissue. It's a long shot, but it's possible. Thomas Green's casket came up first, the mahogany darkened and water-stained from 4 years in the ground. Sarah watched as the forensic team carefully opened it, documented everything, and took samples. Then came William Jackson from 1965, Robert Collins from 1978, and finally, at Sarah's insistence, Leonard Price from 1961, the husband who'd supposedly died of food poisoning. The laboratory work would take months. In the meantime, Sarah pursued other avenues of investigation. She tracked down the attending physician who'd treated Thomas Green, Dr. Raymond Foster, now retired and living in Florida. She called him from her office on a rainy February afternoon. "Dr. Foster, I'm investigating the death of a former patient of yours, Thomas Green. He died in 1991 under your care." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I remember Thomas," Dr. Foster said finally. "I've thought about him over the years, actually. There was something about his case that never sat right with me." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "His blood work," Dr. Foster said slowly, as if he was pulling the memories from somewhere deep. "The potassium and phosphorus levels were extremely high, higher than I'd expect even with kidney disease. I noted it in his chart, but the attending nephrologist at the time said it was consistent with renal failure. I was a resident then, still learning, so I deferred to his expertise. But I always wondered if we'd missed something. Did you know that Mr. Green was the 8th husband of Ruth Holloway to die of apparent natural causes?" The silence on the line was deafening. "I'm sorry, what?" 8 husbands, Dr. Foster, all dead within a few years of marriage, all leaving Ruth Holloway their assets. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Foster whispered. "I had no idea. No one told me." "Why would no one have told me?" "Because nobody was looking at the pattern," Sarah said. "Nobody connected the dots until now." After she hung up with Dr. Foster, Sarah sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the wall of evidence she'd built, photos of all 8 victi. MS, their marriage certificates, death certificates, property transfer records. In the center was a picture of Ruth Holloway from the 1960s, smiling sweetly at the camera, her arm linked through husband number 3's. The more Sarah learned, the more complex Ruth Holloway became in her mind. Yes, she was almost certainly a serial killer, but she was also a survivor of a brutal era, a black woman who'd found a dark path to financial security in a society that offered her almost no legitimate options. Sarah found herself feeling an unwelcome sympathy for Ruth, even as she built the case to put her in prison. That sympathy wavered when Sarah tracked down the daughter of Marcus Webb, Ruth's second victim. Diane Webb Morrison was 70 years old now, living in Atlanta, and she'd been waiting decades for someone to ask her about her father's death. "I knew," Diane said over the phone, her voice heavy with old grief. "I knew Ruth killed him. I told anyone who would listen, but nobody cared. The police said there was no evidence. Said my father had a stroke and that was that. But I knew." "How did you know?" Sarah asked gently. "Because he was healthy before he married her. My father took care of himself. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, worked out every day. Then he married Ruth, and within a year he was dead. And the way she acted at the funeral," Diane's voice broke. "She was playing a part, detective. I could see it. The crying, the fainting, it was all performance. When she thought no one was looking, her face was cold, calculating. She was already counting the money she'd inherit." "Why didn't Ruth have any close family asking questions?" Sarah asked. "Why were the CTMs always isolated men?" "That was part of her pattern," Diane said bitterly. She chose carefully. "My father's first wife, my mother, had died 2 years before. His siblings were all gone. I'd moved to Georgia for work. He was lonely, and Ruth swooped in and made him feel loved again. She was good at that, making men feel special. And then she killed them." Sarah spoke with other family members over the following weeks. Not all of Ruth's victims had survivors willing to talk, but the ones who did painted a consistent picture. Ruth had been charming, attentive, the perfect companion. She'd isolated her husbands from what little family they had, always with plausible excuses. Then they'd get sick, decline rapidly, and die. In March, Dr. Alvarez called with preliminary results from the toxicology tests. Sarah's hands shook as she answered the phone. "We found something," Dr. Alvarez said without preamble. "In all 4 bodies, we detected elevated levels of heavy metals in the bone tissue, specifically arsenic and thallium, both classic poisons that were more readily available decades ago. The levels are consistent with chronic poisoning over an extended period." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling vindication and horror in equal measure. "Is it enough to prosecute?" "It's enough to establish that these men were poisoned," Dr. Alvarez confirmed. "Whether it's enough to convict Ruth Holloway, that's going to depend on your ability to prove she administered the poison. But yes, Detective Mitchell, you were right. These men were murdered." The arrest came on a warm April morning. Sarah arrived at Ruth Holloway's house with 2 uniformed officers and a warrant. Ruth answer. Ed the door in her bathrobe, her white hair uncombed, looking every bit of her 83 years. "I've been expecting you," Ruth said calmly when Sarah read her rights. "I knew you wouldn't give up." At the station, Ruth waived her right to an attorney, which surprised Sarah. Most suspects, especially guilty ones, demanded lawyers immediately. But Ruth seemed almost relieved to finally talk. "I'm going to tell you everything," Ruth said once they were seated in the interrogation room, the tape recorder running. "Not because I feel guilty, I don't, but because I'm tired of carrying it alone, and because I want people to understand why." What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions Sarah had ever heard. Ruth Morris, as she'd been born, had grown up in the Jim Crow South, the daughter of sharecroppers who'd never owned anything, never had anything. She'd watched her father die young from overwork and her mother fade away in service to white families. Ruth had sworn she'd never end up like them, never be powerless, never be poor. She'd married her first husband, James Holloway, with love in her heart. But James, it turned out, was a violent drunk who beat her regularly. When Ruth had gone to the police for help, they'd laughed at her. When she'd tried to leave, James had threatened to kill her. So Ruth had poisoned his food, slowly, carefully, making it look like pneumonia had taken him. "I felt guilty at first," Ruth said, her voice distant, remembering. "I cried real tears at his funeral, but then I inherited his house, his savings, and for the first time in my life I had security, I had power. And I realized something, Detective. I realized that I was good at this. Good at playing the loving wife, good at administering poison in doses small enough that no one would notice, good at crying on cue and making people believe me." "So you did it again," Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "I did it 7 more times," Ruth confirmed. "I chose men who had something I wanted, a house, money, property. I made them love me, made them marry me, and then I slowly killed them. Arsenic in the first few. I'd grind it up from rat poison, mix it in their food. Later I used thallium, which was harder to get but worked better. Caused kidney failure, liver failure, looked just like natural aging." "Didn't you feel anything?" Sarah asked. "Any remorse?" Ruth laughed, a harsh sound. "Remorse? Detective, do you know what it's like to be a black woman in America? To be told your whole life that you're worth nothing? To watch men, even black men, have opportunities you'll never get just because they were born male? I felt powerful. I felt alive. Every time I watched one of them die, I felt like I was taking back something that had been stolen from me." "You murdered 8 people," Sarah said, anger creeping into her voice. "8 human beings who trusted you. 8 men who thought they could own me," Ruth shot back. "Who thought marriage gave them the right to control me, to tell me what to do, where to go, how to live. I gave them a few years of companionship, some good meals, a clean house. And in return, I took what they had when they were done with it. Fair trade, if you ask me." Sarah wanted to argue, to rage at Ruth's twisted logic, but she'd learned over the years that trying to reason with killers was pointless. They'd already justified their actions to themselves, built elaborate mental structures to explain why their crimes were acceptable, even necessary. "The trial is going to be complicated," Sarah said instead. "You're elderly, you're black, and you'll have lawyers arguing that you were a victim of circumstance, of systemic oppression, that you had no other options." Ruth smiled, and it was the coldest thing Sarah had ever seen. "And they'd be right, wouldn't they? I was a victim, I just decided to stop being one. The jury will have to decide if survival justifies murder. My guess is, being who they are, they won't understand. They'll see a monster, not a woman who refused to be destroyed by her circumstances. The trial began in September 1996 and lasted 3 months. It became a media sensation, the case of the Black Widow of Chester County. Ruth Holloway, frail and elderly in the courtroom, became a symbol of different things to different people. To some, she was a monster who'd weaponized society's sexism and racism to get away with murder. To others, she was a tragic figure, a woman who'd been so beaten down by oppression that she'd turned to horrific means of survival. Sarah testified for 2 days, laying out the evidence methodically. The forensic reports showing chronic poisoning, the pattern of marriages and deaths, the financial motive. Ruth's own confession, played for the jury on crackling tape. The defense didn't deny that Ruth had killed the men. Instead, they argued diminished capacity, claiming Ruth had been so traumatized by her abusive first marriage and by the systemic racism and sexism of her era that she couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. Ruth Holloway is not a serial killer, her attorney argued in closing statements. She's a survivor who used the only tools she had in a world that gave her no good options. Yes, she took lives. But what alternative did she have? Poverty, homelessness, more abuse? She made terrible choices, but they were the choices of a desperate woman with no other path. The prosecution countered with the methodical nature of Ruth's crimes, the careful planning, the multiple victims over decades. This wasn't survival, the assistant district attorney argued. This was greed. Ruth Holloway murdered 8 men to steal their assets. She's not a victim. She's a predator who used society's blind spots to hunt for 40 years. Sarah watched it all from the gallery, feeling increasingly conflicted. Ruth was guilty, unquestionably, but was the defense entirely wrong? Ruth had lived through Jim Crow, had been beaten by her first husband with no recourse, had existed in a world that valued her life and labor at almost nothing. Did that excuse murder? No. But did it explain it? Maybe. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they finally returned, their verdict was guilty on all 8 counts of second-degree murder, not first-degree, which would have required premeditation. The jury had apparently decided that Ruth's actions, while criminal, had been the product of diminished capacity and circumstance rather than cold-blooded planning. At sentencing, Ruth stood before the judge, still small and frail-looking, her white hair carefully styled. She showed no emotion as the judge sentenced her to 8 consecutive life terms, with the possibility of parole after 20 years due to her age and health. "Do you have anything to say?" the judge asked. Ruth looked out at the courtroom, at the few surviving family members of her victims, at Sarah sitting in the front row, at the reporters scribbling notes. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "I'm not sorry," she said. "I know I'm supposed to beg forgiveness and cry and show remorse. But I can't. I won't. Those men are dead because I chose to survive, to have something of my own in a world that told me I deserved nothing. If that makes me a monster, then this world made me that way. I'm not the villain here. I'm just the one who refused to die quietly." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Sarah just sat there, feeling the weight of it all, the complexity of justice and judgment and the long shadow that history casts over every life. Ruth Holloway died in prison 3 years later, in the spring of 1999, of natural causes this time. She was 86 years old. The warden reported that she'd been a model prisoner, helpful to the other inmates, always polite to the guards. She'd spent her time reading and writing letters, maintaining her innocence not in terms of whether she'd killed the men, but in terms of whether she'd been wrong to do it. Sarah attended the funeral, held at a small prison chapel with only a handful of people present. Ruth had outlived most of her family, and those who remained wanted nothing to do with her. As Sarah watched the simple casket being lowered into the ground, she thought about the 8 men buried in Greenwood Cemetery, the lives cut short, the families left grieving. But she also thought about Ruth, about the desperate young woman who'd endured abuse with no help coming, who'd looked at her options and chosen the darkest path. Was Ruth a victim or a villain? The answer, Sarah had come to believe, was both. Ruth had been victimized by her circumstances, by systemic oppression. by violence and poverty and lack of opportunity. And she'd responded by becoming a victimizer herself, by choosing murder as a means of survival and advancement. The case haunted Sarah for the rest of her career. She eventually retired from the state police in 2010, after 38 years of service. She'd solved hundreds of cases, put away dozens of killers. But the Ruth Holloway case was the one she thought about most often, the one that challenged her understanding of justice and morality. Because the truth was, Sarah could understand Ruth's choices even as she condemned them. She'd grown up black in America too, had felt the sting of racism and sexism, had seen how the world devalued women like her. The difference was that Sarah had found her power in law enforcement, in being a guardian of justice. Ruth had found hers in poison and manipulation. Years after Ruth's death, Sarah was invited to speak at a criminology conference about the case. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of law enforcement professionals and academics, she tried to articulate what she'd learned. "The Ruth Holloway case taught me that justice is complicated," Sarah said. "We want our criminals to be purely evil, our victims to be purely innocent. But life doesn't work that way." Ruth Holloway was both victim and perpetrator. She suffered terrible injustices, and she committed terrible crimes. Acknowledging one doesn't excuse the other. But if we're going to prevent future Ruth Holloways, we have to understand the conditions that create them. After her talk, a young black woman approached Sarah, a graduate student studying criminal justice. "Do you think if Ruth Holloway had been born in a different time, with different opportunities, she would have been a serial killer?" she asked. Sarah thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," she said finally. "I think if Ruth had been born in a time when she had real options, real power, real protection from violence and poverty, she would have been something else entirely. Maybe a businesswoman, maybe a politician." Ruth was brilliant, strategic, patient. Those qualities could have made her great at a lot of things. Instead, they made her great at murder. "That's the tragedy, isn't it?" the young woman said softly. "That's the tragedy," Sarah agreed. The Ruth Holloway case closed in official terms when Ruth died in 1999, but in a larger sense it never closed at all. It remained a cautionary tale about the intersection of oppression and crime, about how society's failures can create monsters, about the terrible choices desperate people make when they see no other path. The 8 men Ruth killed, James Holloway, Marcus Webb, Leonard Price, William Jackson, Samuel Freeman, Robert Collins, Edward Washington, and Thomas Green, they deserved justice. They deserved to be remembered as more than just victims of a serial killer. They were fathers, brothers, friends, flawed human beings who'd made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. And Ruth Holloway deserved to be remembered accurately too, not as a simple villain or a pure victim, but as a complex human being whose terrible crimes grew out of terrible circumstances. She made choices, deliberate and deadly choices, and she paid for them with her life and freedom. But understanding why she made those choices, that's the work that continues. The work of building a society where survival doesn't require murder, where justice is available to everyone, where the next Ruth Holloway finds another path. Sarah Mitchell retired to a small house in the countryside, far from the streets of Chester County. But she never forgot the case that defined her career. Sometimes, late at night, she'd think about Ruth Holloway, about that cold smile in the interrogation room, about the unapologetic confession of a woman who decided that survival trumped morality. And Sarah would think about justice, real justice, not just the kind dispensed in courtrooms, but the kind built into the fabric of society. The kind that would have protected Ruth from her abusive first husband, the kind that would have given her options beyond poison and patience, the kind that might have saved 8 lives. That was the real lesson of Ruth Holloway, not that evil exists, but that we help create it every time we fail to protect the vulnerable, every time we allow injustice to flourish, every time we force people into corners with no good way out. Ruth Holloway was a killer, yes, but she was also a warning, a reminder that the monsters we fear are often the ones we've made ourselves, shaped by the cruelties we permit, the inequalities we accept, the suffering we ignore. And until we face this, until we build a world where survival doesn't require murder, there will always be another Ruth Holloway waiting in the shadows, choosing darkness because the light has been denied to them for too long.